Today, we're talking about expansions. Hey guys, welcome back to Proper Chuffed. My name's Hilton, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, but that is half the fun of this, isn't it? Before we begin, if you're new to the channel and you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back guys. It's good to see you again. So in my previous video in this series, I spoke about the fact that I'd hit a sort of creative wall. And honestly, it was so refreshing to read all of your comments about how you guys manage your own creative blocks. One of the really great suggestions that I picked up from a couple of you guys in the comments and a few of my friends was to go onto YouTube and just watch some videos of trains running in the area that you're modeling. I did so, and it was something that I've always done, but had recently become so busy that I just stopped doing that. It really helped me, and I came back to Dunroman and the work that I was planning to do this week with fresh eyes and a new perspective, and I really did feel quite inspired. This week, we're talking about extensions. Yep, we're extending Dunroman. Just a little bit, but it's enough that it's a significant step forward for the layout. Have you ever got to a point in a layout build where you've just been like, this is not enough, I need more? I think expanding a layout is a very difficult thing. There's obviously a lot of factors that go into it. First of all, do you actually have the space to expand? I'll tell you where I came from, and I think I'm very grateful for that. When I built Dunroman, I built it smaller than the space that I had, with the intention that should I want more space, I can expand a little bit. It's not super easy to plan in advance for something like that because you usually have a picture in your mind of exactly what you want to do. But let's be honest, we all want bigger layouts. And if you can accommodate it, why not expand? I think one of the key points of expanding a model railway layout is to make sure that you prepare for it well in advance. In my case, I have very solid and sturdy baseboards, which allows me to make these expansions quite easily in certain sections. So like anything else in life, it all comes from strong foundations. So as you can see, there's a fair bit of work that's going on behind me right now as I'm extending Dunroman just a little bit. This is not the biggest space in the world, and it can be a bit cramped, so I have to be very careful if I decide to make some kind of extension, because suddenly my room to navigate this whole room just becomes that little bit more difficult. So this is not a vast step forward, but it certainly is something I've been planning to do for quite some time, because I just feel like the railway line was a little bit close to the edge of the baseboard, especially when I'm trying to get some running shots. Now, this might not matter to you at all. This is the sort of thing that perhaps is maybe more of a YouTube/filming problem. But it was significant enough for me that I felt like I needed to make this change. So this week we're going to talk about that. It's time to extend Dunroman. I've been mulling over this for a while now. The station straight has always felt a little bit like hemmed in, and the northern bend could really use some breathing room too. The idea isn't to make the layout bigger just for the sake of it, but to give the scenery a bit more space to settle naturally, a little bit more landscape shaping, and maybe even something new down the line. Now, I don't want to overdo it either. Space in here is like quite tight. And I still need to be able to comfortably move around the room without knocking anything over. So I've decided on a modest sort of 30cm extension. Just enough to add some visual depth without it feeling like I've built myself into a corner. I start by cutting a few timber lengths to size and fixing them to the existing baseboards as slats to support the new section. I'm using marine ply again for consistency. It's sturdy, light, and less likely to warp when the seasons change. Once that was measured, marked, and screwed into place, I made sure the height lined up fairly perfectly with the rest of the layout. You might notice that this new bit actually covers up my point switches built into the southern board. Don't panic, they're not gone forever. I'll be relocating them later once everything's properly set in place. For now, the priority is getting in the solid foundation for whatever's coming next. And what exactly is coming next? Well, you'll just have to wait and see. Next, we're heading up to the northern corner, the section that arcs neatly into the mountain. This area has been in desperate need of attention for quite some time now. That curved point always makes me a little bit nervous. It's a precarious bit of track that's just waiting to send something tumbling off the edge and down onto the hard tiles below. So I'm really quite keen to get this closed up. Thankfully, it's never happened, but as they say, better safe than sorry. I start by cutting a few bits of timber to fit the space between and securing them to the existing frame. Once these supports are solid, on goes the new section of marine ply, the same I've used elsewhere on the layout. It's brilliant stuff, genuinely. It's dead straight, lightweight, and really resistant to moisture, which is perfect when you're working with glues and paints and scatter materials and water. The only downside is that it's a bit of a splinter factory if you're not careful. The edges can flake when you're cutting, so a bit of sandpaper or a sharp blade is your friend here. Once the board's in place, somewhat secure, not exactly bomb-proof just yet, I give the whole thing a coat of matte black paint. I use matte black always as my base coat because it really helps foliage stand out. So, the plan for this new extension is to give Dunroman a good bit more breathing room. And what better way to do that than by adding a small, very rural parking area? A lot of you have asked, where do passengers alight to? Here's your answer. The idea here isn't to create something overly polished or modern, but rather something that feels right for the setting. Quiet, remote, just a little bit muddy and rural. But I also don't want this to just be a bit of flat ground tacked on. That would feel a little bit too sterile, so instead I'm shaping a natural shoulder between the track and the new land. To do that, I'm using expanding foam. I've done this in the past. It's very quick and lightweight, and it's perfect for creating those rolling sort of soft contours. Now in my mind, Dunroman has always been the kind of little halt that doesn't see a lot of traffic. The sort of place where you'd pull up, park your old Land Rover and hear nothing but the wind in the trees. So there's no need for tarmac or anything too neat. Instead, I'm going for a simple gravel surface. I start by marking out a rough area for the lot, then layer it with fine black ballast to give it that well-trodden, stony sort of look. I take my time flattening this out so it looks like a proper weathered car park, not some rally course. The result already feels in keeping with the sleepy charm of Dunroman. To secure this ballast, I use, you guessed it, hairspray. Honestly, I swear this is the most versatile resource in modeling. I could not have built this layout without it. A light mist over the surface helps everything stay put, and then I follow up with a mix of watered down PVA. Through the magic of capillary action, it flows perfectly between the little stones and binds the lot together once it dries. Simple, but really, really effective. Once everything's set, it's time to blend it into the landscape. I move over to AK's muddy ground texture, my old reliable, and start prepping the edges of the lot with it. This helps give that damp, weathered transition into the surrounding wilds that are yet to come. This is a small touch, but I think it really helps sell the idea that this isn't some perfectly maintained lot, just a patch of rural ground that's seen a bit of rain and use. With that done, I move on to some ultrafine yellow flock over the mud to suggest tufts of dying grass creeping in from the edges. This sort of subtle shift gives the scene a whole lot of life. I go easy on the PVA here, too much and it's going to kind of overwhelm everything. Once it's all secure, I give it a quick vacuum to tidy up the excess. It's all ready to starting to look properly lived in, just the way I kind of like it. Now it's time to bring a touch of life back into the scene with a wee bit of green flock. Using the same method as the yellow, I sprinkled over the lot just enough to break up those harsher edges and suggest the finer grasses and little weeds that would naturally spring up here. This stage is really just prep before we move on to static grass, but I actually think it's quite important. It creates a smooth visual transition between the flatter ground textures and the more pronounced tufts that we'll be adding later. Now we go green, like really, really green. I'm using a new static grass from Noch that I picked up for this part. And it's got such a vibrant, sharp hue to it that it just screams fresh spring growth. This 2mm blend is absolutely perfect for establishing that first lively layer of vegetation. I'm covering pretty much the entirety of the remaining exposed baseboard with this, making sure it's nice and even so we got a solid foundation to build on. It's always amazing how a bit of color just instantly changes the energy of a scene. This is really just a baseline layer, but it's an important one, and from here we'll start adding variety, depth, and all those subtle shades that bring the Highlands to life. I'm now moving on to a mix of longer static grasses, some darker, some with those amber tones, just to break up that hard uniform green and introduce a little bit of depth. This is honestly the part I enjoy the most, because here you really become the master of transformation. You can dictate the ebb and flow of color, shaping the landscape exactly how you imagine it. I even throw a few bit of crimson shades here just for good measure, just to give it that wild, slightly unkempt feel, like nature's been left to its own devices for a while. Layering these tones is a rewarding process, and every pass of the applicator brings new life and character to the scene. In the middle of this board, there's a natural island that forms between the road and the pathway, and I want this to feel really overgrown and untamed, so I'm paying special attention here, layering up multiple lengths and hues of grass until it looks like a proper thicket of wild growth. With the grass in a good place, I move on to placing some small stones around the area. This step might seem minor, but it really ties everything together and helps reinforce that rough highland feel that I'm going for. I scatter stones quite loosely to start, letting them fall naturally, then build up a few sections here and there to create those subtle mounds and patches that you'd find in a real landscape. Some areas I keep quite sparse and I want the ground to breathe, while others I get a bit more attention, suggesting the terrain might have shifted or eroded over time. Now to create a rugged and rural barrier between the railway and the lot, I'm using Woodland Scenic's wire fence again. This one actually salvaged from the farm, or I guess what remains of the farm. Don't worry, I will explain that in the next video. I carefully placed this fence down along the line, but I'm not going for perfection here. In fact, quite the opposite. I give the fence a few subtle angles and gentle bends, just enough to suggest that it's been standing there for years, maybe knocked about by the weather or the odd curious sheep. Small imperfections make a difference. Nothing in the countryside is perfectly straight or pristine, and this old, slightly tired bit of fencing feels right at home in the West Highlands. I still had a bit of fencing left over from the station, and I felt like it would be a nice touch to extend it into the section closest to the transition point between cars and trains. This helps tie the areas together visually and adds a little bit of extra personality to this corner. I paired it with a small Hornby resin house, which I thought gave the scene a bit more character. This building could serve any number of purposes, perhaps an old storage shed, public toilets, or simply a disused railway building that's seen better days. Either way, it felt right to section this area off, keeping wandering explorers safely away from the tracks, while giving the scene a lived-in, functional look. I also added an official station sign to the lot, and to further define the boundaries, I placed some larger stones along the edge of the lot to act as markers. When I visited Rannoch Station last year, I noticed exactly this type of stonework being used to delineate parking and walking areas, so I felt like it was a good, authentic touch. Not only does it add a functional purpose, but I think it also adds that sort of charming rural look that I've been going for. Finally, it's time to bring in the greenery, bushes, shrubs, trees, flowers, many of which I've repurposed from the farm area. I place these carefully but sporadically across the middle island to create that natural, untamed look. Smaller shrubs are added along the shoulder and near the edges of the lot, softening transitions and breaking up those hard lines around the baseboard. And with that, I think I'm ready to call this section good. I'm genuinely very happy with how it's turned out overall. There are still a few smaller details left to add, but for a week's worth of work, this brings us a significant step closer to creating a believable and cozy depiction of the West Highlands. The combination of the lot, the vegetation, and the natural shoulder really helps it feel like it's part of the landscape rather than just an extension. I'd love to hear what you think, so please do drop your comments below. I always enjoy seeing your feedback and responding to your ideas. I'd love to know from you guys if you've ever expanded one of your layouts, and how easy was that process? Was it something that came kind of naturally and you were able to do it quite easily? Or has it proven challenging? Do let me know in the comments below. When I began mapping out this small extension on the northern side here, I really hadn't given it much thought. I didn't think that this was going to be an amazing piece of scenery, rather just a small, fairly uninteresting extension to Dunroman to make it a little bit more visually appealing and settle it into the tone of the rest of the layout. However, I actually think that this has turned out super well, and I'm really happy with it. Now, it might just be that it's brand new, but it's quickly become one of my favorite little sections because suddenly I'm able to capture the rocks that are behind here, because previously it was all way too close in terms of the railway. So now I've got this foreground here just before the rocks and the hills behind it, and I think that really does look quite good. Now there's still a few small things that I want to do to this, some muddy tracks going into the parking lot, and I definitely need to do a little bit more work on the castle itself. But for a week's worth of work, I'm really happy with how it's turned out. You know, when you're building a model railway, you're always trying to replicate something, whether that's from your mind or a memory or a picture. You always want to evoke a certain feeling. There's a feeling that you get more so than what it actually visually looks like. I want Dunroman to feel like a place that is familiar to people who have traveled to the West Highlands. Obviously, it's not a direct replica of any one particular thing, but drawing from memory, images, and certain landmarks that are familiar to a lot of people, I want to evoke a feeling of warm coziness, of cold winds sweeping across mountains, the odd downpour of rain, and the smell of fresh, crisp, clean air. And sometimes when I look at certain things on the layout from a certain perspective, I do get that feeling, and that's always a good thing. I'd love to know what you guys think about this layout. First of all, you know, does it make sense? I hope it does, because I think the problem around passengers alighting off the Dunroman station to where has finally been answered with the parking lot, and it's kind of charming. I kind of like it a little bit. It's taken up quite a bit of real estate, I'm not gonna lie, but I think it suits the part. I also really like the footpath that goes behind it all the way up to the castle, as very often a tourist would probably pull over, stop, and take a walk up to the castle and take in the sights and sounds of the railway alongside it. I'm really happy with this, and I think it's going in the right direction. Next week we're going to be talking about the mirroring extension on the other side, which was previously a farm. Unfortunately, the farm got blown away, so tune in to find out exactly what's going to happen with that. As always, I just want to thank my Westies for your continued support. Your support honestly means so much to me. A big thank you to Annie, Mystic Brick, Simon Thompson, Bill from 3B Rail, Jersey Bill, McDave, Chugwater Jack, Tony from Choberton Junction, Derek L, James from the Little Western, Dan from Pedantic Mongrels Railway Channel, Clagfest, Valleys 5600, SBJ from Emperor's Path, Johnny from the 62C Workbench, Phil from PN Trains, Steve Room, 71D Productions, Joachim Bankston, Scott Wood, Rod Pethrick, Hogsmeade Branch Line, Tim Krinsky, Rob's Rails, Simplazy Model World, Jonathan Regazzoni, Ratmat RC, Dylan Somerville, Aaron Douglas, Kraus Rails, Lydia Somerville. Are you guys related? Rob from the Kiln Line, Tim, Martin, and Luke Jackson. That is all I have for you this week. Thank you so much for watching, and if you did find this useful, please consider sharing it with someone who might be learning too, or just drop me a thumbs up if you did. Until I see you next time, keep your engines fired, and of course, stay on track. All the best.